Here's what they don't tell you about medieval vice: brothels weren't just tolerated, they were protected. Picture torchlit lanes where guards kept order while councils counted taxes, not bruises. Why? A safety valve for swarming unmarried men, apprentices, journeymen, traders, even clergy, so other women's honor stayed intact. The prostitutes, necessary sacrifices. Their bodies absorbed the danger so towns avoided riots, rape, and scandal, ready to meet the machinery behind that bargain. Picture this: a slick riverside alley where the air tastes of urine and coal smoke, where men line up like customers at a market stall, and the city council keeps a ledger with their names. In medieval towns, brothels were not hidden chaos, they were urban policy, cordoned to bridges, riverbanks, or a Frauenhausgasse, so the watch could corral trouble, and the council could collect rent. They posted ordinances on timber posts. They nailed stewhouse signs to doors. They listed prices in city accounts line by thin ledgered line. You won't believe what happened next. Licenses were granted, rules were set. No married women, no minors, curfews, bans on holy days, limits on pimps. In some towns, prices were fixed to prevent brawls. This actually happened. Historical records show fees entered with the same neat penmanship as taxes and tolls. The city did not pretend benevolence. The calculus was brutal. Let prostitutes be visible and contained, civic leaders argued, and the streets would be calmer, apprentices less violent, clergy less scandalous. The lesser evil was a policy choice. Think that's brutal? It gets worse. Women were marginalized physically and legally shoved to the edge of town between the Jewish quarter and the river in Prague, housed outside the walls in an abora, or kept on Krakow streets' extreme fringe. Bruges was an exception, but most towns enforced distance while still guaranteeing access for merchants and foreigners. Records from Munich show a municipal Frauenhaus established in 1433, a house run not for protection but for order. Visual control mattered. Striped hoods and yellow veils marked those who were licensed. Men surrendered arms at the door in Pamiers and Venice. London restricted prostitutes in 1393 after assaults. In Valencia in 1488, all prostitutes were made to live in La Pobla after violence rose. Yet policy had limits. Bribes greased ringleaders. Clandestine rooms hid trade back in dormitory streets near universities. Epidemics or scandals triggered periodic cleanups, a purge that sent women into darker alleys and worse danger. Here is the part they do not teach in school: the brothel was a machine, cold, bureaucratic, efficient, that made a city govern its sin like it governed its grain. Unbelievable but true. And the more orderly the ledger, the more human lives it squeezed into place. But that is not the worst of it. Next, we will pry open the city ledger, smell the ink and blood on the margins, and meet the women whose names appear only as numbers, because when a town bureaucratized, sex people became line items in policy. Let's crank the heat on this. These were no cozy city morals, but a brutal machine that fed itself on human bodies. Think of Munich 1433, when a municipal brothel was not a rumor but a legal pillar for the good of the city. London's 1393 restrictions followed brutal street assaults in Venice. Citizens surrendered arms at entry to keep the peace. In Prague, 3 legally distinct districts weren't accidents, they were a system. Krakow Street nudged clandestine workers to the edge. Bruges stuffed brothels into the wealthiest blocks, a chilling pride of official tolerance. Valencia's La Pobla corralled every prostitute into one quarter. After violence spiked by 1488, all had to live there. It wasn't compassion. It was control dressed in paperwork. Certificates, house regulations, municipal brothels. These weren't benevolent reforms. They were armor forged to keep the city's blood from spilling into the streets. Here's the brutal calculus: allow vice openly and you quell chaos. Think that's leniency? It was ruthless practicality. Lesser evil regulations kept the crowds in check, but they tethered real people to ledgers with a theatralized smile. Prostitution became a municipal industry with licenses and fines filling coffers. In every city, names stamped on papers, in every house, rules posted as if at a market stall. The red lanterns were not signs of care, but control a visible price tag on a woman's body. This actually happened. Historical records prove it again and again. Councils chose ledgers over lives, trading human dignity for a quiet night and a steady tax stream. And the consequences were brutal. Guards logged every name. Brothel owners posted market bylaw rules. Women carried papers stamped by magistrates. Failure meant fines, exclusion, or worse. City coffers swelled on license fees and the pain of fines. Vice became a municipal industry. Apprentices paid to access rooms. Sailors slipped coins through shutters. Merchants treated licensed rooms like office spaces. The glow of red lanterns, steam from baths, and a halberd at the door didn't signal mercy. It signaled that every breath came with a price tag. Imagine ledger entries replacing cries. Imagine a town where a single line on a page decided a woman's fate. Next, we pull apart those ledgers and reveal what the numbers hid. How many women, how many nights, how many deaths lurk behind the queens of iron and ink. This is where the real horror lies. But that wasn't the worst part, because the same system that protected towns could swallow the women it regulated. 2 4 or more shared beds, 2 hours on patrol, 10-foot thick walls that kept heat out and misery in. If you fell asleep, everyone paid. Stay with us, because the next section exposes the hidden costs and the ghosts behind every ledger line. Think you've read Grimm? The archival truth will demand a new kind of courage. Imagine a walled town at dusk, lanes narrow enough to crush a sigh, and hundreds, no thousands, of unattached men pressed shoulder to shoulder, their tempers snapping as easily as the hinges on the city gates. Their beds were temporary, loyalties fluid, and every vow made in a chapel sounded faint in a market street alive with risk. Marriage came late, housing was a joke, mobility a fever, ale cheap as air, and every festival poured strangers into streets 3 or 4 men wide. Civic panic, not sermon, shaped the rules. Brawls, harassment, rape, scandal. Threats to order and reputation, not sins to be preached against. Better a controlled outlet than a city boiling over became blunt municipal logic. Magistrates and preachers, sometimes reluctantly, shared the calculation. This is why towns licensed brothels as civic plumbing. If prostitutes were available, they would serve as a safety valve. Historians note diffusing the combustible mix of young men and alcohol. Cities corralled sex into boundaries. Prague carved 3 legally distinct districts for prostitutes. Hampes between the Jewish quarter and the river Abura, beyond the walls under city protection. Clandestine women on Krakow Street. Always on the edge, so demand remained reachable but visibility reduced. Bruges shocked observers with its exception. Brothels in the richest quarters, serving merchants and visiting dignitaries, where commerce demanded discretion. Practical measures reveal the fear beneath the policy. In Munich, in 1433, authorities established a municipal brothel expressly for the good of the city. By 1488, La Pobla confined all prostitutes to 1 quarter after violence surged. London's 1393 restrictions responded to assaults and murders when men met harlots, especially foreigners, at inns. Men entering houses of ill repute often had to surrender arms, at Pamiers in Venice, because magistrates feared knives and brawls more than lust. Think that sounds cold? It gets worse. This actually happened. The rhetoric of the lesser evil was blunt and unsentimental. Permit vice to avoid collapse. That calculus rarely included protection for the women themselves. Marginalization was routine. Their quarters on city margins, their lives regulated but exposed. This might seem distant, but the shock travels. We think modern zoning and red light rules are harsh, but medieval policy treated women as movable parts of a city's engine, expendable if it kept the gears from grinding to a halt. Watch how these borders became cages. Regulated entrances, tolls, health inspections, punishments for escape, and brutal public shaming when scandals erupted. The town's need for order made cruelty admissible. Consider the tolls, coins rattling through grooved wooden boxes, the sharp intake of breath as a door clanged shut, the cold bite of a corridor that stank of tar and damp wool. Public reprimands in pillories, weeks of confinement, branding in rare cases. These aren't abstractions. They were daily risks that could erase a woman's name, her livelihood, even her life. Next, we peel back the curtain and meet the women who paid the price for civic calm and remember them. This actually happened in cities you've walked past under statutes you've never questioned. And the deeper truth isn't about vice. It's about power, fear, and how a town chose containment over crusade because riots, scandal, and ruined trade would kill a city faster than a tolerated vice. But the worst part is still to come, how the margins of safety became the cages of existence, and what that did to real women living under the shield of the law. Think that's brutal? It gets worse. In the next section, we meet the women, learn their names, and hear the echoes of their silenced voices through the centuries. Picture this: 20 candles guttering over 8 fetid iron tubs, the air thick with sweat and burnt tallow. By midnight, 30 men have cycled through one parlor, leaving coin sweat and a bruise or two. Apprentices, students, journeymen, foreign traders, even a priest who swears he won't be recognized. This is the town's night shift of desire. The madam barks orders, doorkeepers check tokens, laundresses haul steaming sheets through narrow alleys. Music blurs the edges of transactions. Wine jugs are drained like small funerals. The scent, a brutal blend of copper, tang, soap, scum, and fear, hooks in your throat. This actually happened. And it happened again night after night until the ledger itself started to stink with the truth. Doors shut at the watch bell. Shutters slam. A bouncer, the town's muscle, tosses out the staggering clerk who paid with a bad promise. Fees are posted on the wall, coin or token only. Men surrender knives and daggers at the threshold because towns learned the hard way that unregulated lust meant blood in the gutters. Municipal authorities sometimes tolerated or even installed brothels as a lesser evil, a place to channel the thousands of unmarried men who flooded medieval towns. They did it for order, not mercy. Think that's brutal? It gets worse. Historians note these weren't simply houses of pleasure, but critical cogs in a fragile civic machine, a public health ledger written in velvet and iron. The houses sit on margins. In Prague, they wedged brothels between the river and the ghetto, and other towns they shoved them outside walls. Bruges was different. Its houses of ill repute sat on wealthy streets, serving merchants and officials who needed discretion. Location mattered. Too hidden and customers vanished. Too open and the watch lost its grip. This isn't poetry, it's policy. Historical records show city leaders wrestling with crowds that could swell to thousands during fairs, a market of flesh that needed to be corralled as surely as cattle. In the ledger, every doorway carried a risk, every candle a vote, every paid kiss a line item. The reality? It was a clockwork of fear, protection, and profit designed to prevent chaos without pretending to cure desire. Inside, it's sensory overload. Candles sputter. Baths steam and stink. Flesh presses flesh. A barber surgeon is summoned when a lover's elbow splits a lip or a quarrel ends with a dagger's gleam. Sometimes he patches wounds, sometimes he can't. Quarrels over coin are routine. Broken promises turn into brawls, spilling into alleys where knives do the talking. People died. Regularly. Horribly. And yet the system endured because regulation felt safer than an unregulated death toll in broad daylight. Then came the moment they don't teach in school. Protecting prostitution was about protecting the town, about keeping blood off the market square, about admitting that control, not virtue, kept the peace. But you won't believe what happened next. Imagine being branded with a badge and a rule while the town kept 1433 reasons to sleep easy and 1488 laws to patrol every breath. You arrived hungry. You left a village for work that never came. You were sold by a landlord or sold yourself to survive. This was the road into the municipal brothel. It was also the civic medicine everyone praised. Officials said prostitution was a safety valve for apprentices, journeymen, foreign traders, clergy. And so the city stitched protection into law. That protection wore a costume, a uniform. You wore a collar, you wore a badge sewn to your sleeve that announced you were marketable and disposable. This wasn't metaphor. It was procedure, paperwork, and a chokehold. They corralled women into 12 districts outside the walls between the river and the Jewish quarter on the city's extreme edge. Bruges was a glittering exception. Where brothels nestled in rich neighborhoods, most towns hid women on margins yet kept clients perilously close. Men were even required to surrender their arms at the door. The rules kept the town tidy, not safer. Think about that order created by surveillance and punishment, not protection. The legal shelter was a double bind. You were safe from random arrest and also publicly labeled, forced clothing marks barred from certain streets and churches, fined for stepping over an invisible line. The violence never stopped. Clients beat you. House staff beat you. Pregnancy meant no support, just abandonment at a foundling wheel or a cold shove into a penitential house during a roundup. Disease moved faster than mercy. The pox tore through bodies long before any cure. Flesh broke. Scabs ruled faces. People died. Regularly, horribly. Burials were humiliations too. Many were cast outside consecrated ground, think London's crossbones, parceled into graves beyond prayer. Some women clawed savings to become a madam and by a lease, a few won a fragile sort of security. Most kept one ordinance away from ruin. Historical records are blunt about the bargain cities bought order, not safety. This actually happened. Think that's brutal? It gets worse. Protection brought order for the town, but rarely safety for the women. Records show municipal brothels from Munich in 1433 to La Pobla in 1488, and ordinances like London's 1393 were touted as civic medicine, a lesser evil. But lesser for whom? For women it meant humiliation, injury, disease, life counted in fines and bruises. This isn't ancient rumor. This is documented precedent, a blueprint of how safety can become surveillance, control, and ledgered abuse. Think you've heard the worst part? Think again. Because the next chapter asks who paid the real price and who kept the keys to pretend safety. In the shadows, we'll uncover the exact people, the exact sums, and the exact night the system cracked. Coming up, the hidden costs of protection and the brutal math behind it all. Picture this: a room where men cough into damp straw and a shadowed woman stitches a dress with raw hands. By 1495, a terrifying new sickness, the French disease, raced through ports and market towns, turning bodies into open wounds and brothels into contagion engines. Think of it as a virus of vice chewing through the city's balance sheets. Town councils had once treated licensed houses like fire breaks, pockets where lust could be taxed and brawls diffused. But with venereal infection and recurrent plague, the logic inverted. Municipal brothels that city magistrates opened for the good of the city were suddenly liabilities. Royal edicts and council ordinances, hungry for moral and medical control, began to shut them down. In 1546, the notorious Southwark stews were suppressed. German towns shuttered Frauenhäuser as Reformation and Counter-Reformation moral strictures hardened. But closure did not mean disappearance. It meant darkness. Where lawyers and taxmen once walked the thresholds, a different world grew. Rented garrets, back alley bargains, rooms by the river where no magistrate kept the keys. The visible economy of regulated sex collapsed into an invisible one. Taxes vanished. Records froze. And the physical protections that had existed, surrendering arms at the door, city watch patrols, even municipal oversight, vanished with them. Women who had a thin legal status were now cut loose. Protection became a memory. Violence rose. When brothels were legal, a town could enforce rules. When they were not, clients met women in alleys at night where a slab of moonlight was the only witness. Think that's brutal? It gets worse. The safety valve argument, prostitutes as a pressure release for unmarried men, had always been callous but pragmatic. It never promised care for the women it commodified. Once civic tolerance collapsed, that cold calculus turned lethal. Preachers recited sermons about sin and contagion. Civic ordinances rebranded civic virtue to exclude tolerance. Historical records, church courts, council minutes, and riots show the trade receding into peril. More arrests for street prostitution, more anonymous infections, more women fined or enslaved. This actually happened. The market adapted, but the costs shifted. Women paid in bodies, in freedom, in blood. You won't believe what happened next. Records from Munich in 1433 show a municipal brothel set up for the good of the city. Blunt-proof cities chose control over purity. Prague's brothels hugged the margins. Bruges hid them in wealthy quarters because demand always finds access. Officials disarmed clients at the door and monitored inns. When that monitoring vanished, so did accountability. Robbery, assault, and blackmail rose. Women were left to negotiate danger in silence. Next, the business of survival went underground, and it got bloodier. Contemporary records count the human toll. Next, the true price is revealed. Imagine a street where the city buys peace with bodies. Picture hundreds of unmarried men, apprentices, journeymen, foreign traders, even clerics, packed into cramped lanes, a demographic pressure cooker historians call a safety valve. In towns of roughly 8,000,12 souls, the licensed workforce rarely ran into fewer than 150, and often swelled into the low hundreds. In the peak years, it would not be crazy to map 25% of the adult male population living in or near those narrow, stinking seams of the city. This wasn't romance, it was a safety tally, a cold arithmetic that kept the riot at bay. You can see how they made it work. Brothels were pushed to the edges, between the river and the Jewish quarter, outside walls on fringe streets, or in exceptional places like Bruges, tucked into the richest lanes where merchants demanded easy access. Cities drew hard lines around space and desire, corralling sex into discrete zones so customers could reach it without letting vice sprawl into the marketplace. In places like Bruges, stews were virtually mapped into the fabric of the city, 2 to 4 blocks carved out for commerce that few outsiders could ignore. The logic was municipal and brutal. Town councils set up official stews, forced men to surrender arms at the door, and sometimes confined all prostitutes to a single neighborhood after outbreaks of violence. They did this not to save sex workers, but to stop fights, murders, and reputational disasters that could topple a town's whole order. When violence spiked, ordinances followed. Public order cost something. It cost women's safety, mobility, dignity. Think about it, a single curfew could erase a woman's livelihood, and a private room could be the city's only shield against a 2 a.m. raid. In a year of plague or festival, fines piled up like iron on a scale, and the ledger never lied about who paid the bill. Think modern zoning is tame. This was commerce and containment writ in law. It's an ancestor of today's red light districts and harm reduction debates. Regulate and control, or prohibit and push things underground. The lesser evil calculus that underpinned medieval policy isn't history's odd relic. It's the same math activists and politicians still wrestle with: tolerate one harm to avert many. Only then, as now, the costs fall unevenly. Cities kept a ledger of who paid the fee jumpers, the families, the women who kept moving, and the men who never faced a single day in the docket. There's a sociological wrinkle: rituals and symbols hid harder realities. Laws, ordinances, and ritualized toleration were not neutral. They encoded who a city would shield and who it would consign to the margins. Historical records show town clerks, ledgers swelling with arrows, stamps, and signatures, proof that the city's compassion was never universal. Archaeology and court rolls confirm it. Think that's brutal? It gets worse when you map who paid the bill in taxes. The city's balance sheets didn't just reflect revenue, they reflected who endured violence, who lost mobility, and who faced daily humiliation for a system built to keep the peace at any cost. You won't believe how blunt the trade-off was. Towns exchanged public calm for private suffering, writing it into statutes and budgets. Cities are machines that manage desire and danger. The stews force a hard question we still dodge: who do we choose to protect, and who do we decide is expendable? The answer then, as now, writes itself into the minutes and the margins, into the very air the citizens inhale at dawn. But that's not the last word. This is only the surface, a prelude to the deeper, bloodier calculus: how fear, money, and power mold who gets warmth and who learns to endure the cold. The next chapter unmasks the bodies behind the numbers, the women, the apprentices, the guards, the households, and asks you to face a question that echoes into today's debates about policing, zoning, and social safety nets. Think that was cold? In truth, the story only deepens when we turn to the people who paid the price and the way cities learned to survive by counting bodies. Because if you can stomach the math, you'll see a pattern that survives into our own towns. Order costs more than money. It costs people. And the chapter to come reveals exactly who paid and how. Ready to meet the names, dates, and broke bodies behind the ledger? The next part will pull back the curtain on the true cost of keeping the peace.